Greetings, everyone. I'm Jed Schlackman. I work as a holistic counselor, psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, and energy healer. And in that role, I come across a variety of patterns in people's lives, different ways that they relate to the world psychologically and energetically. I often refer to the type of healing work I share as psychoenergetic healing. So I'm working on multiple levels, on a conscious psychological level, a subconscious psychological level, as well as an energetic level. Everything is really sort of interconnected. You can't separate one from the other. So consciousness and energy are not two separate things. Energy actually is the way consciousness is expressing and manifesting itself, and ultimately it's creating physical reality, presenting this physical matrix or field of experience for consciousness to have a reflection of itself. So in the video I'm doing right now, I'm going to speak about treating or addressing the narcissistic type of personalities, and that includes what people call narcissists as well as sociopaths or psychopaths. Basically personalities that are in some way predatory and abusive and displaying a lack of empathy toward others and an over preoccupation with meeting one's immediate desires or needs without looking at a bigger picture, without consideration for others. We've all come across people with some of those personality traits, and they can exist on a continuum, on a spectrum, so everyone can access those types of traits to some extent in some situations, circumstances, or environments. You might see almost anyone start to act somewhat in that narcissistic manner. However, there are people who would be diagnosed with a clinical personality disorder who are really very extreme, who are very much immersed all the time essentially in that way of functioning. It's their default, their primary way of relating to the world, to their social environment. So that's where people are given that type of a label, when it's that very clear extreme version of it. And those types of individuals are not likely to voluntarily seek any type of treatment or therapy to address that. And that's really based upon the very nature of that pattern. Those are people who are not willing to acknowledge that they have some weakness or problem or something wrong with themselves that needs to be addressed. They're not willing to be open and vulnerable, to be honest about themselves with a desire for change or transformation. They will tend to consistently point toward other people as the source of whatever challenges or problems seem to be present in their lives. They're not taking responsibility for their role in creating situations. They always try to make someone else appear to be the so-called bad guy. They may play a victim role to gain sympathy from other people. However, in their own mind, they never look at themselves actually as the victim, not on the conscious level. Subconsciously they may feel like they've been victimized, they've been betrayed or harmed in some way, but they're not willing to acknowledge that feeling within themselves. So what they do is they reverse the role in a sense. They become the person who controls and manipulates other people, who points toward other people as the bad guy, even when they themselves are the ones abusing or oppressing someone. So they often do what people refer to as gaslighting, where they try to deny reality and convince other people that those other people are the ones who are in some way wrong, in some way flawed or defective or abusive, etc. So they try to make their victims feel guilty when it's actually the person who's narcissistic who's the one inflicting harm or pain or suffering on that other person. So as I've said, those types of individuals are quite unlikely to voluntarily seek therapy. If they do so, it may be in a kind of false way. They're putting on a pretense of getting treatment because that's something they need to do to navigate a relationship or deal with some issue that's been brought up in their life, where they need to convince other people that they're actually seriously working on themselves, trying to improve themselves. But typically they would just be acting there, feigning it. They would not be truly seeking to acknowledge they have a problem per se. They're not truly seeking to change themselves. They're just going to therapy as a way to manipulate some situation to their benefit. So if you're a therapist working with them, you have to kind of have your eyes open to be aware of that possibility, that the person is actually using or manipulating you as the therapist to in some way serve their agenda, to help them deceive or mislead other people. So they are often very skilled at manipulating anyone in their environment to support whatever their agenda might be. So that's a typical trait of someone who is psychopathic or narcissistic, that they'll use any trick in the book, so to speak, to get other people to support or enable their own behavior or their own agenda. Now, if you ever did have someone who's dealing with that type of personality, who's acknowledging it, who actually does want to change, to not be stuck in that identity for the remainder of their life, consider that is a possibility. It's not common, but it could occur. And in order to address that, to actually help them with that goal of overcoming that type of personality, you'll need to understand what are the factors or elements that created or initiated that way of functioning, so that you can provide some form of therapeutic intervention that's actually going to get to the root of that pattern. You really want to get to the core of their identity, of how that personality developed, understanding what role or function it plays, how it supports that person's sense of safety or survival or well-being, and how you can help the person release the compulsion to use that mechanism or pattern of behavior to address those needs, and to actually address those needs in a more healthy or more soul-based way, where they don't need to control and manipulate, to exploit or oppress other people, to feel content within themselves. So to look further at that pattern of narcissistic or psychopathic type of personality structure, I'm going to share a little bit first from a book by a bioenergetic healer. This is a book called Light Emerging by Barbara Ann Brennan, and she's what many would think of as a spiritual energy healer or clairvoyant energy healer. She developed skills to perceive the energy field and to see energy patterns in a person's energy field, what we would call the aura, including how those energy dynamics play out when people interact with each other. So if there's a couple in a relationship and one of them is a narcissist, so-called, and the other person in that relationship is an empathic type person, highly empathic or sensitive, how are their energies interacting? How is that functioning? So we're going to look at what she refers to in Light Emerging, and this is a cover of Barbara Ann Brennan's book. She refers to this as a character structure, and that character structure she refers to as psychopathic, being one of the 5 major character structures that she outlines in this paradigm that she's presenting. So for each of these structures, there are certain issues that are present, and there's kind of an outline of looking at these issues and how you might perceive and approach them if you are trying to bring healing for that individual. So for the psychopathic structure, she says the main issue is betrayal. So typically that would be something that occurs at a rather young age in that person, since we're developing our personality usually starting at a pretty young age, an early phase of our life. So even as an infant, as a toddler, we're starting to develop our personality based upon what's happening socially in our environment. So if you're betrayed by people close to you at a very young age, you might feel a lot of intense anger, and at that age it's actually hard for you to influence your environment. You don't control those people who are responsible for taking care of you or attending to your needs. So you might just have this unresolved or unexpressed anger or rage within you, and as you grow older you're not really conscious of that, but you develop ways to try to protect yourself from feeling that emotion, from being immersed in it. So you might learn certain mechanisms to try to control your environment, to try to impose your power, or create this facade of being invulnerable, of being a strong person, of not having a weakness. So those are kind of coping mechanisms in a sense, or survival strategies to maintain your sense of self, to kind of claim that feeling of power from, or compensating for that time when you felt powerless. So we mentioned the main issue there being betrayal, then the core fear is the fear of letting go and trusting. So that person who's narcissistic or psychopathic in this model, it's actually very hard for them to relax and trust other people. There's a part of their consciousness that's expecting other people to in some way betray them, to cause them that suffering. So it's as though they're going to do it to other people first before other people could do it to them. So they become the perpetrator in order to avoid feeling like they could become a victim. What they've experienced was that they were used and betrayed by others. So that just correlates with the main issue of betrayal. Next, she refers to a defensive action that this type of character structure is manifesting, and in this case it controls others. So pretty much everything they're doing in terms of their relationships with other people has some form of control agenda or intention behind it. By controlling other people, they feel more safe or secure, and they feel they're protecting themselves from being harmed by others. So you can think of an example of someone who wants to observe and monitor and spy on everyone around them. A reason they're doing that might be because they're actually on a deep level afraid that someone is going to do something that's going to hurt or betray them, and they feel they can protect themselves, they can keep that from occurring by being hypervigilant in monitoring and controlling everyone around them. Results of defensive action. So because they're using that defensive action, what is the consequence or result of that? And the result is aggression and betrayal drawn to self. So it's kind of this vicious cycle. Because they're acting in that way, it kind of attracts more of the same experience of being hurt or wounded. So they're doing things that are very controlling and hurtful to other people, and it's kind of a hopeless cause to believe that you can succeed with controlling everyone and making sure no one ever betrays you. So at some point, people are going to betray them again, especially because they're not trusting other people, they're not being compassionate toward other people, they're actually generating ill will from other people. So other people are either going to turn on them or do something that's going to make them feel betrayed, even if it doesn't happen right away. Their oppressive and manipulative and abusive behaviors at some point would lead other people to betray them, to not maintain cooperation, to not continue to follow them. Next in this model is what's referred to as relationship to core essence. And here it's described as the person is afraid that their essence is bad or evil. So it's kind of a complex, convoluted thing to wrap our minds around. But let's suppose that person was abused or betrayed as a child by a caretaker, someone who is supposed to love, supposed to appreciate, to protect and nurture them. So when that happens, they can actually feel within themselves that there's something bad or wrong with themselves, that there's actually something evil or bad about themselves It's a reason that other person mistreated them. It's kind of saying to yourself, well, this wise parent, this loving parent, is doing what they think is the right thing as a parent, so if they mistreated me, they must be punishing me because I'm bad. So the problem is me. I'm bad, I'm evil, there's something defective within myself. So the very young child might attach to that idea or belief that there's actually something about their own essence that's bad or evil, which is ironic because in order to shield themselves from facing that thought or belief, they actually deny any potential idea of there being something wrong with themselves. They try to make themselves look super good. They convince other people of that, as well as convincing themselves of that. So it's kind of this paradox. How could someone break out of that pattern? How can they actually face their deepest fear about themselves? Now, they have a human need in this model to trust others, to be able to make mistakes and still be safe. So you would need to learn the capacity to be human, essentially, to recognize that as a human being we're not perfect. We do things that are sometimes flawed or unwise or hurtful to others, and that doesn't make us inherently bad or evil. It just means we're imperfect in that context, that we make mistakes, we do things that are foolish or impulsive, we do things that cause harm to ourselves or others, and to be able to acknowledge that, to actually feel safe facing that reality, to not feel deep pain or suffering from seeing that we're not perfect. Then in this model there's what Brennan calls the spiritual need, and here the spiritual need for this psychopathic personality structure is to recognize and honor the core essence and higher will of others. And finally, there's a issue here that she refers to as time distortion. So for each of the character structures, each of these personality patterns, there's a way that they relate to time that's somehow out of balance, you could say, somehow distorted. And for the psychopathic type, she says that they're rushing into the future. So if you think about it, they're always kind of future directed. They're trying to achieve something, to control things toward their future goal or desire, and they're not patient about it. So there's this kind of time pressure there, like they need to get things done now. They need to get everything in order to have this safe, secure future that they desire. But it's, again, like a paradox. The more they're trying to do this, the more they're actually creating pushback, blowback, you could say, unsafe conditions. So they're always going to be stuck in this sense of feeling unsafe, of feeling that other people are going to betray them or harm them in some manner. So going through that now, this brings me to the question of how would you address this therapeutically? How would you treat this if you actually encountered someone with that narcissistic or psychopathic pattern who truly is open to treatment, who truly desires to change the way they relate to the world, to change how they're thinking, feeling, and acting in their everyday life. The way I look at that is that you have to get to the core to get lasting results. So if you're just trying to provide a behavioral intervention, some form of positive reinforcement or some form of consequences or punishments per se, that's not going to have a lasting impact. And you could see that in how there's recidivism with people who have these patterns who go through the justice system. You can put them in jail for however many years, and once they're released and come back into society, they repeat the same patterns because their personality, their core way of relating to the world hasn't changed. They haven't gotten to that deep part of themselves to release whatever trauma or betrayal occurred. They haven't been able to access their spiritual essence to bring them a sense of peace, a feeling of trust, a sense that they can be connected to people, they can have interpersonal attachments per se, and not have to be constantly afraid of betrayal. They can actually accept that as human beings, we're all, in a sense, imperfect. We all make poor choices sometimes. We all may feel regret about choices or things we've done, and that's okay. We can be resilient. We can pick ourselves back up and go forward in our life and not feel shamed, humiliated. We don't have to feel we're inherently bad or evil or any of that. We can have that inner peace and self-acceptance, which ultimately comes from an awareness of our spiritual nature, that we are each part of a greater spiritual essence that created us for a purpose, for its own self-expansion, self-exploration, and that spiritual source or essence always accepts and embraces us, no matter how far in our own imagination we've separated ourselves from it. No matter how bad or evil we think we are, there's ultimately no judgment, rejection, no ultimate condemnation coming from our spiritual higher self. That aspect of ourself is just kind of there trying to inspire and guide us to in some way reconnect with who we truly are, to remember our true self or core essence. So for healing work, processes that help people bypass their logical mind, help them get over their intellectual thought process, help them start to feel their body and their emotions more, help them open up to whatever has been repressed, which includes some deep emotions, which could be deep shame, deep anger, a feeling of having been betrayed or rejected. Once they're able to access those feelings and allow them to release, it brings an opportunity to kind of reset or re-pattern their personality. If you never go to that deep level, then it's unlikely you're going to have much success or much effect in trying to shift the personality, since the personality is based upon some very deep levels of programming, deep instinctual reactions to some form of pain that occurred. That could be both physical and emotional pain, one or the other or both. The pathological personality types that we're discussing can actually be triggered in some cases by physical injury. So certain types of injuries to the brain or nervous system can trigger a reversion to that type of functioning, that type of reflexive self-protection, where a person is trying to control their environment and not able to feel empathy for others. That's reflected actually in our biology as well. It could start out with the psychological trauma and the psychological protective mechanism that's triggered by that trauma, but in order for that to actually be carried out or played out in our human lives, it means there's some type of alteration in the brain, our actual physical mechanism for experiencing relationships, experiencing our sense of self and consciousness as a human being is impacted. So the psychological trauma actually creates a biological trauma. The functioning of the brain pathways and brain regions will change as a result of that, while if there's a physical injury that occurs directly to the brain, that can actually trigger the shift in the personality. So it can go both ways. In either case, to facilitate healing, it would help to be able to access a deeper level of self beyond both the biology of the physical body and beyond the coping strategies or adaptations of the personality. And this is why I'm saying if you could bypass those, if you can access a spiritual component of the self, then you have an opportunity to connect with something that can bring a different state of awareness or consciousness into the mind, into the emotional self, into the physical self. That's really the challenge here. How are we going to access the aspect or component of self that hasn't been injured, that hasn't been stuck in this seemingly pathological protective or defensive strategy? So I encourage those of you who are working with people that are open to some form of healing to bring in methods that help overcome those cognitive barriers, that help transcend the intellect, that help go past emotional reactions, that help calm down the biology. So if you can help bring the nervous system into a very calm, secure state where you don't need to be so protective, then you could start to create this opening, this window through which you can tap into the deeper parts of the self, including accessing any unresolved traumas and accessing the spiritual higher consciousness that doesn't feel broken, that doesn't feel afraid and betrayed. So things like breath work, energy healing, some forms of meditation and hypnosis. So these are some of the complementary modalities that I feel could be helpful. You could also bring some educational material to clients or people that you're working with that give them insight into how and why that personality structure or pattern developed, understanding that there's a reason for it. It's actually a form of self-protection in a way, to avoid experiencing pain and suffering, to avoid self-judgment or self-condemnation. So the Light Emerging book, that gives some useful insights. So that's one reference you could explore. On a more practical, perhaps, and less spiritually oriented level, there are resources that give a in-depth discussion about the predatory personality types, narcissism, psychopathy, sociopathy, and explaining how they operate, giving some insight into both the perspective of the narcissist as well as the people in their environment who are being impacted by them. There's a very current, recent dissertation that I've seen covering the subject of predatory personalities, how they operate in society. It's by a woman named Karen Mitchell, who did a PhD dissertation on this subject. You can search for her material on the internet. It's been published as a PDF, so you can read that for free. You can also find her on social media. That gives some rather detailed research material from many people, interdisciplinary, across many different professions who have dealt with those personalities. So that includes therapists, it includes people in business and law enforcement, etc. So helping people understand themselves and understand how they're interacting with others can be kind of a baseline of starting to activate this therapeutic process. That's working on the conscious level, and once there's that kind of basic conscious understanding, then it's actually easier to work on the subconscious levels, on the more spiritual and energetic levels. For those that are interested in holistic healing and other personal growth resources, you can visit my website, phinsights.com. That's phinsights.com. You can also view other videos that I've created on these topics. For now, I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful day. Namaste.